Hello and welcome everybody. Today I'm going to be doing a 2024 presidential election prediction with DeSantis on the Republican ticket and Newsom on the Democrat ticket. So this is a potential future matchup, actually, maybe further down the road, not as likely in 2024 as 2028, but I'd be curious to do more 2024 because it's more recent and it's a little bit easier to predict closer than further into the future. So I'm going to do it now. DeSantis an obvious frontrunner in the future, at least, and potentially, obviously anyway, the guy who will run if Trump doesn't in 2024, and then Newsom. A lot seem to be thinking he's potentially the future kind of frontrunner type Democrat candidate that will be going after Biden because Kamala Harris herself is a horrible, just a garbage candidate. Nobody likes her. Not even Democrats like her. Her approval's in the drain. It's worse than Biden's. And even Biden's questionable. If he runs in 2024, which I still think will happen, it'll be a Trump versus Biden rematch. But it's very possible Newsom is the guy who runs in 2024, assuming Biden doesn't end up running because of his health catching up to him, which it pretty much already has. The guy is completely out of it, and pretty much everything he says is just reading notes. But that aside, I'm going to do a bit of a prediction here and see who I think would win between the two of these people. So I'm going to fill out the safe states first, get that out of the way so we don't have to talk about those because these are already fairly obvious. People know these states by now. They know safe states, they know which states are safe, and there's no reason to really talk about safe states. So I think these will all be fairly self-explanatory as well for the Democrats. Nothing really changing here that people shouldn't expect. This is probably the safe states for both candidates. So this is fairly standard. Now it starts to break off here. These are both governors right now. They're both currently governors in their respective states of California and Florida. Now, Florida is a better state by far. A lot of people are leaving California to go to places like Florida, partially because of DeSantis's leadership and because of how horrible Newsom's has been. And something interesting to consider here, especially with Newsom, he has a 53% approval, which seems decent, but in a state that is like, if you look at it, the state itself voted 63.5% for Biden. So at least 14% of the Democrat voters do not approve of him, which is interesting to say. And really, he's not that likable of a guy. He doesn't do amazing in California. Like, he has decent polling numbers in California, but he himself is not very popular nationwide, and not many people really like him. The overall Democrats don't, not Democrats, sorry, Californians don't approve of the state, the direction the state is going. They don't really approve of the state of California itself. Like, they have issues with it, but for some reason they don't seem to link any of that to Newsom, even though more or less it's completely down to him as a whole being a bad governor. Now, Florida, we also have DeSantis, who has done a great job. He hasn't locked down. Well, he did for a very short period, but he was the first to open up. He didn't push any of the woke garbage. He called out Disney. He's been like, okay, a lot of his policy hasn't been the most effective in the world. Yes, there's been some, it's not been the best in the world, but some of that is being kneecapped and held back by the House there. But overall, he has been better than most other governors in the country. He's been very successful at what he's done. He's a popular man in the state. The state itself is trending to the right. And overall, he's very popular amongst the Republican base. There's a lot of the more moderate Republicans, which is something to be skeptical of, but they support him, as well as a lot of the MAGA Republicans. So long as Trump and DeSantis don't run against each other, that support will be unified. Now, the issue here is how willing a lot of the Republicans, the establishment Republicans, are to support him. That's something to be skeptical of, because there's got to be a reason for it. I'm going to move on a little bit, start doing each state, filling out the rest of the map. So we'll go with the likely states: Texas, Florida would if DeSantis is on the ticket. Texas, Florida, if we look at the election anyway, it was about an 8-point margin for Trump in 2020. I do think overall the trends would reverse a bit, and I do think DeSantis could continue the trends in the more Latino parts of the state, the more Mexican dominated parts. And then Florida itself trending to the right. This is fairly obvious. Most of my predictions have these two states likely right now because they pretty much are. I could even see Miami-Dade flipping in 2024, assuming DeSantis is the candidate. The Cuban vote likes him. The state of Florida likes him a lot anyway, so home state advantage, that will do well for him. I could even potentially put one of these two in the safe column, but I'm going to keep them in likely for now. Now, I also think there is one other likely state for Republicans in this scenario, and I think that would be North Carolina. That might be a little controversial to some, but I think Republicans could get within the margin of a likely 5-point margin. In the past, it's been a fairly Republican state, but Trump won it both in 2016 and 2020. He won it by about a point and a bit, 1.5 or something in 2020 here. He won it by more than in 2016, but DeSantis would appeal a little more in the state to the northern part of the state here. He would help with suburban parts of the state, which would help as well amongst moderates, which would help the state itself probably flip a little bit further to the right again. And I think those trends would also be seen similarly in Georgia, but not to as great of an extent. Moving on to the likely states for Democrats, I think in this case Colorado would be likely, and I also do think Virginia would be likely. I did go in a 10-point margin for Biden, but I do think, again, that would reverse a little bit, and it'd be about 8 points or so for Newsom. He's not as popular. He is. I don't think he has the ability to get people out to vote. Neither does Biden, but it's not really a protest vote year either against Trump. That's something to consider. A lot of the vote from 2020 was, oh, well, I just don't like Trump, so I'm voting for the other guy. In this case, it's not it's Trump, so I'm voting against him thing. It's not an incumbent. It's DeSantis. It's a new guy. Yeah, a lot of people have heard of him, but it's not enough to have all these people go, oh, no, I'm protest voting against him. So overall, I don't see those margins being as realistic, the 10-point margins in both states. So likely, I think they're going to be likely column, not safe columns, like they pretty much were in the last election. Now, moving on to lean states, this is where most of the rest of these states will probably fall. I think Georgia goes lean in this scenario. He would, as I said, like in North Carolina and even a bit in Virginia, DeSantis would reverse the trends a bit, especially around the suburban areas in Atlanta and a bit around here in Columbus area and Augusta as well. Overall, that's all he'd really need to flip the state back into his column, at least for, it was only a 0.3% margin, but at least for 2024, not likely, as it will get harder further down we go. But polling does also have both Walker and the current Governor Brian Kemp ahead. Both of them are probably going to win in their respective elections in the midterms. So I do want to consider that in play for Georgia. Another state I think would be lean in this scenario would be Arizona. That one, I've spoken on this before, but Arizona, I think, will trend back to the right. I think 2020 was a bit of a fluke year. I don't really agree. These results are sketchy at best anyway. And moving on, we also have Nevada, which some people are going to disagree with, but I think it would go in a lean margin for DeSantis. The state, I've done a video breaking down Nevada, its trend to the right, and why it will be a Republican state in the future, and why we're going to win it in the midterms. The state is trending fast to the right, and easily it is a margin that can be made up by 2024. I do think DeSantis would be able to pull it off. I also believe Wisconsin would be lean. The state itself is already pretty much a Republican state. 2020 was an odd year. It was only a 10,000 vote margin. I also think Pennsylvania I've mentioned before, I've spoken a lot on Pennsylvania in a lot of my videos. The state is trending to the right quite hard. Its voter registration is increasing more and more for Republicans. A lot of polling trends are starting to favor Republicans as well, more in the state going into the midterms. So overall, I don't see it likely that Pennsylvania doesn't at least go for Republicans by about 1%. Now, this is where it gets a little bit closer, but I do think New Mexico goes lean for the Gavin Newsom. For Gavin Newsom, I don't know who the running mates would be, but I do think it's lean. The state could potentially have a Republican governor by the end of the midterms, which will have an impact, but it won't be enough, I think, to actually flip the state overall outright. Nebraska's first district, or second district, I actually think could go in a tilt margin for Republicans. I think it would reverse again. The suburban support and the more moderate support would help a lot. Omaha, I think, could flip back. Actually, I see it very likely it flips back. So I'm going to give that to DeSantis as well. Now, Maine at large, this one's interesting. Maine at large was closer, at least in 2016, but in 2020 it widened a bit again. I think the state itself could potentially go in DeSantis's column. I think he'd be able to get the state at large in a tilt margin. It would be close, but I do think it's achievable for him. Maine's first district is not likely to be achieved. It's much more left than the rest of the state. So overall, likely Maine at large would go solidly, not solidly, sorry, tilt for DeSantis, but its first district goes for the Democrat, Newsom. Now, New Hampshire as well. I think this one's easily winnable for DeSantis. It was closer again in 2016. I think 2016 margins are more realistic and likely in a DeSantis-Newsom scenario than the 2020 margins. It was a very, very good year for the Democrats. It was a very blue environment, so that helps a lot. So overall, I'd give New Hampshire a tilt R in this 2024 election scenario. And I'd also do the same for Michigan, a state that I do think will trend easily back to the right, and I think it is going to continue to slowly trend to the right in the future. Now, lastly, we have Minnesota. This one is interesting. I think the state was closer as well in 2016. Again, those margins will be more realistic, but if in the more Minneapolis area, in Minneapolis, St. Paul area, if DeSantis can increase the margins in like Rice County here or in Scott or Carver County or Washington County or Anoka County, if he can increase the margins here in the more suburban areas, he can kind of bring out some of the moderates. It's possible he could get the state close enough, and I'd say he even gets it in a tilt margin. So that's the election prediction. I think DeSantis would win the election with 329 electoral votes to Newsom's 209. I do think he would win the popular vote as well by at least 1 million or 2 million. Kind of depends. It varies a bit, but I do think it's a very winnable election for DeSantis, and I don't see it very likely Newsom would be able to win it. I don't honestly think Newsom will ever even be president. He may run. I do think he could run, but I don't think he'll ever actually be president. Anyways, that's the prediction. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. I also post more content on my other social media, so please consider checking me out there. The links will be in the description below. If you have any thoughts about this prediction, or if you disagree or agree, let me know in the comments. Anyways, that's all. I hope you guys have a good night.